What image of a vampire comes to mind? It's unlikely to be a decaying zombie or an old man from a black and white movie. Most likely, it's a gothic aristocrat from Transylvania. Or maybe a mysterious Sigma boy, a pale, handsome millionaire. The bottom line is that these creatures seduce and suck blood. They fear the sun, silver, crosses, and aspen stakes. Sounds familiar, right? Well, 80% of that is not true. This is the BLESARD channel, and it was created so that you have something to watch before bed. And this is a story about real vampires. Real historical vampires did not live in castles, drink girls' blood, or bite their necks. And the effectiveness of aspen stakes is, to put it mildly, questionable. However, sickles and axes worked perfectly against them. Real vampires were mostly simple peasants. We even know the names of 4 real vampires, and the Romanian Vlad Dracula Teeps is not among them. These people rose from their graves and drank the life force of their fellow villagers. And this did not happen in ancient times, but only 300 years ago. Archaeologists still find such burials, especially in Poland, and in the United States. Vampires were hunted throughout the 19th century. Let's start not with ancient times but with the present day. Imagine the year 2004. A quiet, depressing village in southern Romania. Midnight. 6 local residents with crosses, pitchforks, and shovels go to the cemetery. They dig up the grave of Petre Tomi, an ordinary farm worker who died in the winter. The men take out the corpse, cut open the chest with pitchforks, remove the heart, drive wooden stakes into the body, and sprinkle it with garlic. I repeat, this was only 20 years ago. Rumors spread throughout the village that Petre Toma was a vampire. The participants in the ritual were arrested by the police. They claimed that they had come to put the living dead to rest, who rose at night and sucked the life force out of his fellow villagers right from the grave, without even biting them physically. The villagers claimed that when they opened the grave, Petre Toma was lying as if alive, and his mouth was full of fresh blood. They dismembered him, burned his heart, dissolved the ashes in water, and gave it to a sick relative to drink. The woman recovered immediately. For the villagers, this was enough evidence. For the judge, however, it was not. The Van Helsings were sentenced to 6 months in prison for desecrating a corpse. This story shows that belief in vampires in Romania is more alive than anyone else. This is not surprising, since the most famous vampire in world culture, Count Dracula, comes from there. It all started with a quote from the diary of Irish writer Bram Stoker. A young man comes out and sees some girls. One tries to kiss him, but not on the lips but on the neck. The old count intervenes in devilish anger. "This man is mine, I want him." In 1890, Stoker had a nightmare. A ruined castle, a coffin from which an old vampire rises, and a girl who wants to kiss him with long fangs. Stoker was 40 years old at the time and decided that this was a plot. In 1897, Dracula was published. The novel became Stoker's most successful work, making the vampire theme mainstream. Of course, Stoker was not the first. 50 years before him, there was Alexei Tolstoy's novel The Vampire, and even earlier Goethe's poem The Corinthian Bride. But it was Stoker who was able to shape the canon of the genre. Even the image of the vampire as a sexy heartthrob is not a modern invention, but Stoker's legacy. If you are unfamiliar with the plot, here is a brief summary. Young lawyer Jonathan Harper travels to Transylvania to sign documents with Count Dracula, who wants to buy property in London. The Count turns out to be an ancient vampire, imprisons Harper, and sets off for London himself. There he infects Harper's fiancée Mina Murray and her friend. Harper escapes, returns to London, and together with Dutch vampire expert Professor Abraham Van Helsing and others, hunts down and kills Dracula and breaks Mina's spell. Interesting fact: Stoker had never been to Romania. How did he describe it? Simple. He went to the library, took books about the region, and copied them. He had a friend, Arminius Vambury, a Hungarian university professor. But Arminius, although a citizen of the same country, had never been to Transylvania or Romania either. What could he tell Stoker? About the same as a Texan could tell him about Canada. The third source was tourist guidebooks. The entire novel is written in the style of travel notes. So Stoker did not hesitate to insert entire paragraphs from advertising brochures. Names of trains, hotels, routes. From a modern perspective, Dracula is a slightly chauvinistic novel. It is a gentleman's view of Eastern savages. Stoker's most accurate description of Slavs is of the Ukrainian sailors on the ship on which Dracula is traveling. Slovaks and Romanians are portrayed as almost savages, and gypsies as second-class beings. The novel about the Romanian vampire is based on an Irish legend. Long ago in the north of Ireland, King Abhartach ruled, an evil dwarf sorcerer and tyrant. He was killed by a neighboring king. But Abharta, having been buried, climbed out of his grave the next day and sat on the throne again, demanding the blood of his subjects to sustain his life. He was killed again and he rose again. The Druid suggested that Abhartach was an undead corpse and could only be killed with a wooden sword, almost an aspen stake. He was killed, buried upside down, and his grave was sealed with a stone so that he could not escape. This story was published in a collection of Irish legends 20 years before Stoker sat down to write Dracula. Stoker, as an Irishman, knew this story inside out. An evil vampire ruler, a castle, blood, wooden weapons. Does any of this ring a bell? Professor Van Helsing explains in the book that a vampire has the strength of 20 men, is more cunning than death, and is the devil incarnate. Van Helsing explains this to the Englishman because vampires are, oddly enough, Slavic undead. Everyone had legends about the living dead. The Scandinavians had Draugr, dead Vikings who ate travelers. North America, the Wendigo, a traveler who feels eternal hunger. South America, Pishtakas, dead conquistadors who devour fat. Slavic lands, vampires, ghouls, Strigoi. You could meet Strigoi in The Witcher, by the way. Why do they love blood? Since ancient times, it has been noticed that if a person bleeds, they will die, so blood is a substance of life force. Hence the idea, the dead need blood. Moreover, until the 19th century, it was believed that vampires could magically extract blood without even leaving their graves. Just as witches take milk from cows, from a distance. How did a person become a vampire? Improper burial, killed by robbers, suicide, not buried with a funeral service and buried behind a fence. The spread of Christianity, pagans burned their dead. But in Christianity, no, which means the corpse can climb out of the grave. Physical factors. Bodies in the ground can swell from corpse gases and take a long time to decompose. Peasants saw a well-fed and rosy-cheeked corpse and thought, he must have tasted blood. They could also think this about people with abnormalities, for example if you have a mental illness, strabismus, or even just red hair. Another hypothesis is that people with porphyria, a rare genetic disorder, could have been mistaken for vampires. Their skin is pale, they are afraid of light, their skin rots, their nails resemble claws and their teeth turn red. It is logical that such people could have been mistaken for vampires. In Stoker's work, it's simple. Cut off the head, drive an aspen stake through the heart, use a cross and garlic. Real hunters acted differently. Stake. It was more important that it was a stake, not an aspen one. The wood could be any kind or even an iron rod, as in Bulgaria. The goal was to pin the corpse securely to the ground. Hunters would have laughed at Van Helsing, who shot stakes from a crossbow. They did no damage. Garlic. It was used not because of its magical properties but because it smells bad. It was believed that vampires were afraid of any strong smells. You could smear manure on the door, that was also protection. But the question is, would you have any guests after that? Silver bullets, an expensive metal. The logic is simple. The more expensive the weapon, the better it is, as in RPG games. Christian cross did not always help. There were stories of a priest poking a vampire with a cross, and the vampire laughing. The most effective method, dismemberment. In vampire graves, the head is often separated from the body. In Poland and Serbia, a well-sharpened scythe was placed on the throat of the deceased, who could rise again as a warning. If you wake up, you will lose your head. The real picture was different. People suspected, gathered, quietly went, dug up the grave and did something to the corpse, which did not even resist. After the 17th century, stories about vampires began to resemble fairy tales. But then politics intervened and caused widespread vampire panic. In 1725, Austrian official Johann Frambolt arrived in the Serbian village of Kiselevo to execute a vampire, a peasant named Petar Blagojevich. After his death, he allegedly appeared to his widow demanding shoes, and 8 people died that week. Quote from the protocol, "There was no stench coming from the body in his coffin as there is from the dead. The body was completely fresh, his hair, beard, even his nails, were swollen as never before in his life. In his mouth, there was a little fresh blood." Blagojevich was impaled with a stake and burned. The protocol ended with the thought, maybe Serbian legends are not lying? 5 years later, another vampire appeared in the village of Medvedia, an Albanian refugee named Pavlo, who himself said that he had been bitten by a Turkish vampire. Austrian police and military medics discovered a whole vampire clan there. A dozen dead bodies that had not decomposed and had even gained weight. They were all burned. These were the official reports of the Austrian police and doctors. As long as the villagers believed in vampires, no one cared. But when an Austrian military doctor sent a report to the Vienna Medical Journal and the army headquarters got involved, panic ensued. 18th century newspapers, similar to modern blogs, picked up on the hype surrounding the Serbian dead who had come back to life. Panic spread throughout Austria. People dug up corpses en masse, impaled them on stakes and burned them. The level of madness was like during the witch hunts. The Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia had to issue separate decrees. Calm down, there are no vampires, these are all superstitions. In Austria, priests were even forbidden to open vampire graves without imperial officials. The panic lasted for half a century and only ended in the 1770s. In Europe, the panic subsided, but in the USA, it was just beginning and lasted throughout the 19th century. The image of the vampire changed here because of tuberculosis. It was a time of industrialization. People were moving to cities. The cities of that time were crowded, damp, unsanitary, and filled with smoke from coal stoves. Tuberculosis thrived and there were many patients. What impression did this make? A person was lively and cheerful, and then they fell ill, grew weak, turned pale, and died. It looked as if someone had sucked all the life out of them. The sick were often called the living dead, pale, thin, with bright red lips. This quality was transferred to vampires. This is a very serious change in image, because earlier popular imagination required that a blood-sucking vampire be fat and ruddy. After the vampire hysteria of the 18th century, Europe strongly associated vampires with the Balkans. Therefore, although Stoker based his story on an Irish legend, he moved the action to that region. He added romantic details to make the vampire look like an attractive thief, a refined aristocrat who can turn into a bat. At the same time, Stoker attached a historical character to vampires, Vlad Tepes, who ruled Wallachia in the 15th century. In this way, Stoker made Dracula the main vampire. Stoker did not care who he based his story on. Initially, the vampire was supposed to be just the count, and the setting was Styria, modern-day Slovenia. There were also stories about vampires there. For example, Juraj Grande, mid-17th century, was the first historical vampire whose name we know. He was a drunkard and a brawler from the town of Cringe. After his death, he came to his widow, asked for love, and then wandered around and knocked on windows, and every time he appeared, someone died. They tried to pierce him with a stake, but he just lay there and laughed. Only cutting off his head helped. If Stoker had chosen this setting, the result would have been a black comedy rather than a dark thriller. But the writer talked to his friend Arminius, learned about Transylvania, did some research and was inspired. And so Dracula became the character we know today. So, Stoker decided that one book about the history of Romania, written 100 years before him, would be enough. The main thing was that there was a real prototype, the bloody Prince Vlad Tepes, also known as Dracula. Who was this man really? Let's start with the obvious. Dracula was not a count and never lived in Transylvania. The real Vlad ruled Wallachia, a state in the south of modern Romania. Tepes means the impaler. That's what they called him after he died. And Dracula means dragon, a nickname his dad gave himself. His son just turned it into something like a last name. Vlad ruled Wallachia in the second half of the 15th century during extremely unstable times. Romania was squeezed from the south by the Ottoman Empire and from the north by Catholic Hungary and Poland. Vlad had to fight non-stop and constantly change alliances. His reign lasted only 6 years, after which he was overthrown. Of course, he became famous not for this but for his cruelty. It was said that he loved to impale his enemies. Once, hundreds of stakes with impaled people stood around his palace, while Dracula himself feasted nearby. Or how Vlad ordered Turkish ambassadors who refused to remove their turbans in front of him to be nailed to the ground by their heads. These stories paint a picture of Ramsay Bolton from Game of Thrones, a talented commander but a complete bastard. But this portrait is most likely far from the truth. The whole story about his bloodthirstiness comes from Catholic monks. Dracula once promised the Pope to convert to Catholicism, but changed his mind and threw the monks in prison. Those who escaped began to tell all these terrible stories. The printing press came to the rescue. There were no newspapers yet, but there were engravings and pamphlets, something like the tabloid press. And, of course, stories about the bloody ruler boosted sales. 15 years after Dracula's death, a book about Dracula the Tyrant, Voivode, was published in Germany. It collected all the stories about mass executions on stakes and about Vlad eating bread dipped in the blood of the executed. The book became a bestseller of its time. Important: we have no Romanian chronicles about Dracula, only German and Russian ones. But Bram Stoker didn't care about these details. He seized on the image of a tyrant who dipped bread in blood and turned him into the most famous vampire in the world. To give you an idea of how little Stoker cared about the real story, he even changed Dracula's nationality. Instead of a Romanian from Wallachia, he became a Hungarian from Transylvania. Even though the real Dracula fought against the Hungarians. Stoker chose Dracula as the hero because he was already a local meme. After the novel was published, this meme became global. The image of Count Dracula from the book became much more popular than the real Prince Vlad Tepes. Even Romanians indirectly acknowledge this by actively monetizing the image of the vampire's homeland. For example, today any tourist can visit Dracula's castle, which in fact has nothing to do with the historical Vlad Tepes or even Stoker's novel. It is simply the medieval Bran castle on the border of Wallachia and Transylvania. Vlad at best passed by it, but he certainly did not live there. The Romanian authorities chose it because it is atmospheric and is located approximately where the castle in the book stood. Don't think I'm criticizing Stoker. On the contrary, his book is great. Few people manage to create such a popular image that defines an entire layer of culture for decades to come. But his fictional character Dracula was so real that some people began to confuse him with real life. 1909. The novel was translated into German. In Transylvania, there was a castle called Bytinikers, which had been uninhabited for 200 years. It had a reputation as a haunted house. Suddenly, a rumor spread: the owner had arrived and he was a real count. It must be Dracula, thought the villagers. They armed themselves with pitchforks and torches and went to kill the vampire. The poor count tried to explain that he was an officer in the Austrian army and had come to see the property he had inherited. It didn't help. The angry crowd burned down the estate. Fortunately, the count was not killed. Where did these people get the idea that Dracula had come to visit them? They had read Stoker's book. This was not the only case where people, influenced by fiction, thought they had encountered a vampire. Later, Hollywood picked up on the image. In Stoker's novel, Dracula, despite his outward attractiveness, is pure evil. At first, it was the same in the movies, but then the picture began to change. Vampires went from being monsters to people with their own truths. In 1992, Francis Ford Coppola's film Bram Stoker's Dracula was released, which, contrary to its title, was yet another reinterpretation. Dracula was given a wife who was forced to commit suicide. Now Dracula is not just a villain, but a tragic character who became a vampire because of a broken heart. By the way, the love story of Dracula and Mina is also a figment of the screenwriter's imagination. In Stoker's novel, the Count simply used a defenseless girl without any deep feelings. Around the same time, Interview with the Vampire was released, offering us a glimpse into the world through the eyes of vampires, with their dramas and desires. Comics added vampire superheroes such as Blade and Morbius. And it all ended with parodies like Real Vampires, where they are no longer superheroes, but simply folkloric characters living among us. This is the path that the myth has taken, from a Slavic peasant with a scythe who was expelled because of tuberculosis, to the bloody Prince Vlad, reworked into a melancholic Gothic aristocrat and the evil descendant of Attila, and finally to a tragic hero who fits well into modern culture.